Hello again, and welcome back to another edition of the Wiccan Conservative. I had the coronavirus fight show up right on my door, and I won't go too much into details, but I wanted to share with you guys some information that I found while I was fighting my fight, and hopefully it will make its way to the right people who need this information to fight their own fights in the future. So the first thing that I want to tell you guys is if you have not been to the WHO, the CDC, the EEOC, and the ADA websites, you need to get on there and you really need to start doing some homework based on what is actually happening in the workforce when it comes to testing for coronavirus. The CDC declared the coronavirus a worldwide pandemic. There have been some changes to the ADA guidelines and the EEOC guidelines. But the interesting thing that you'll find if you follow along with me here is that just because a virus or an illness is declared a public health crisis, it doesn't necessarily mean that you lose all of your rights as a employee of your company. So, according to the ADA, you can be medically tested in your work facility. That has always been a thing. Now, the funny thing about these medical tests is the medical tests have to be distributed indiscriminately across the board. There has to be a very specific way about going about these tests. So according to the ADA, must be based on objective evidence obtained or reasonably available to the employer prior to making a disability-related inquiry or requiring a medical examination. Now, this is where the CDC guidelines come into play about declaring coronavirus an international pandemic. Now, because they have done that, the ADA states that that is considered reasonable belief. It's reasonably believed that coronavirus is indiscriminate, and they can now require these medical examinations because the CDC has allowed the reasonable belief expectation burden to be met by simply declaring this coronavirus a pandemic. A direct threat, according to the ADA, would be an individual posing a significant risk that cannot be eliminated or reduced by reasonable accommodation. Now, that has 4 factors that it has to adhere by. It has to be number 1, the duration of the risk. So when it comes to the instance of the coronavirus, they're not really sure how long you're considered a risk, which is why a lot of these employers are requiring their employees to undergo medical testing. Number 2, the nature and severity of potential harm. Since the CDC has declared coronavirus a pandemic, they are stating that it has a high severity and potential harm to everybody that comes in contact with an infected individual. So there's 2 met for the definition of a direct threat based on simply declaring coronavirus a pandemic. Now, the 3rd and the 4th are a little bit wishy-washy if you ask me. The 3rd burden of proof is likelihood harm will occur, and the 4th burden of proof is imminence of harm. So when we talk about what the CDC and the WHO has said about asymptomatic infectees and the imminence of their presence to other people, by declaring the virus a pandemic, they would like you to believe that the burden of likelihood of harm and imminence of harm to others is also met. But what really makes me question those 2 burdens being met is the fact that they have not actually proven the CDC and the WHO has not actually proven that direct contact in a general vicinity with an infected person indefinitely infects the non-infected person. If you're having a hard time following this, you're supposed to, because they don't want you to understand what they've proven with their science and what they haven't proven with their science. So when you go to the CDC website itself, the CDC recommends not everyone be tested for coronavirus. If you're going to go get a test, they recommend that you have symptoms. Now, coming back to the direct threat burden, i.e. the duration of risk and the nature and severity of potential harm, if you're temperature screened, but you're not getting any other symptoms, then how are you supposed to know if you're sick or not? Well, of course, then they want you to go get tested. And then once you go get tested, they can go ahead and kind of lump in those last two burdens and say, okay, if you test positive, you are now likely to harm somebody else in the workforce. And the imminence of that harm is high because you have now tested positive for the virus. But the problem with the testing is that there's 3 different kinds of tests that you can get. You can get a viral test, just a confirmation that you have the active virus or you have an active coronavirus, because we're still not even really sure if this narrows down to Corona-19 or if it's just coronavirus in general, because again, like I've been telling you guys, this is not a new virus per se. This is just a different strain of a virus we already knew about. So there's no definitive proof that we are getting tests done that specifically tell us this is coronavirus 19. We're getting tests that are typically more along the lines of just, hey, you have a coronavirus. The second test is an antigen test. An antigen test also tests for active cases, but they're saying that an antigen test is less reliable. So when they're doing the antigen test, they're not coming back as definitive as they're claiming that a viral test is, but it still is, again, just a test for an active case of a coronavirus. And the third test that they're doing is the antibody test. The antibody test tests to determine past infections or if you have the presence of the antibodies already in your system. So they're saying that PCR tests or the viral tests caution health and exposure history. This is what I was telling you about whenever I said that they don't know if they're actually testing for COVID-19 or if these tests are picking up a coronavirus in general. So right after they're done telling you about the tests and what each individual test does, they're telling you that they're not very accurate or conclusive because they really don't know how to narrow down which specific qualities of this virus classifies it differently from any other coronavirus other than the effects that they're having in the elderly and people with underlying conditions. So the CDC also cautions that you can test negative on these tests if you're tested too early. This also brings into light that these tests are not accurate and they are at times very inconclusive as to who is actually infected by coronavirus and who is not infected by coronavirus. So with all of that knowledge, we go back to the EEOC guidelines for testing employees in the worksite. According to EEOC guidelines, tests must be accurate and reliable. Employers may consider false positives and false negatives, and accurate tests only reveals that the virus is present, and negative tests don't guarantee that future infections will not occur. So knowing all this information, we're kind of at a loss for how the EEOC is allowing your employers to test you based on the suspicion of a virus without violating your medical rights. When it comes to administering these tests and these medical proceedings, you still have a burden of privacy. So according to the EEOC, the employer has to keep any medical testing done on their employees separate from the employees' files in the building. So if they are doing temperature screenings, or if they're keeping an immunization record, or if they're, requiring you to go through any type of physical fitness tests or anything to that degree, all of that documentation pertaining to you has to be separate from your personal employee file in the building. The contradiction that happens here is when the coronavirus was declared a pandemic, the health department has stepped in and started asking for documentation regarding the positive cases in the employer's business. So ultimately, the employer was now given the right to disclose the name of a positive testing person to a public health agency, which in and of itself violates the requirements of keeping those medical records separate from the employee files. And the whole reason behind it is so that you cannot use that information in the workforce against that person in the workforce. So my question to a lot of employers is, why are we allowing a CDC or a health department agency to come in and dictate to the employers how they're going to treat their employees, how they're going to treat their employees' information, and when are they allowed to violate your medical privacy in coordinates with the CDC tracking COVID-19? These are really interesting questions, and a lot of people don't even think about what their rights are in the workplace because we don't have a lot of rights in the workplace. Now, when we talk about medical violations and discrimination based upon medical reasons, when the CDC allowed the coronavirus to be called a pandemic, they thought that they destroyed all of your medical privacy. And I believe ultimately that was the goal, was to destroy your medical privacy so that they would be able to distinguish who were carriers and who weren't carriers and push the narrative that they're trying to push. But when you go back to the actual information given by the CDC and the WHO, none of the testing and none of the procedures that they have in place meet the actual burdens to release this information out into the public, or even more so to push you into a testing site or bar you access from your job, because there's just not enough information given by these tests. They aren't accurate. They're not coming in conclusively. They're not giving proper data. And even if you test negative today, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to go out into public and be a direct imminent threat to your coworkers tomorrow. So there's a lot of different moving parts that you have to keep in the back of your mind and pay attention to in order to keep your own medical privacy, in order to keep your own self protected. And at the end of the day, of course, you always have the option of at-will employment. If you're not a contracted government agent, then most people enjoy the luxury of being able to pick and choose their jobs. And I know, again, I've talked about this, that sometimes that's not the greatest feeling in the world. You don't want to feel like you're backed into a position where you have to quit your job or you have to find a new livelihood, a new way to make money for your family. But nobody said that this fight was going to be easy. Nobody said that this fight wasn't going to be dirty. And nobody said that you just be complacent because that you have to do it. You don't have to do it. Just because you don't like the choices that are in front of you doesn't make it any less of a choice. You always have that choice to go above and beyond. Now, the issue is a lot of people are being complacent. They are just doing what they're told. They don't know their choices and they don't understand the information that's being given to them. So I thought it was really important to bring up a little piece of information when it comes to your rights in the workforce and what you must consent to and what you don't have to consent to when it comes to a coronavirus, or even in the future, the possibility of vaccines. Now, the nice thing about knowing this information is you can start practicing that now, and you can start voicing your opinions properly now, so that when they roll out this vaccine and your employer says to you, well, you went and got tested, so there's no real reason why you can't go get injected with this vaccine, you can say, stop, wait a second. I didn't go get tested. I didn't do these things because this is firmly and directly against my belief system. And then it turns into a Title VII battle between you and the employer, and not a burden of the employer protecting the rest of the workforce. I hope this is easy for you guys to understand. If it's not, I apologize. It's very confusing, especially when you're being told one thing and the actual websites and information that you get say something completely different. So I encourage everybody, please, please, please go to the EEOC website, read through all their coronavirus rules and restrictions and things that they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. Go to the ADA website, read through all the things that they are allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. Look up definitions of words, understand the meaning of those words, compare it back to what the bona fide health officials are saying, because even the bona fide health officials are contradicting themselves. And if you point out those contradictions and you bring it to their attention, hey, look, guys, this is happening and this is not in coordinates with what the guidelines say, there's no contest. You have to be able to articulate yourself well. You have to know what you're talking about, and you have to pay attention to the guidelines when they change. And don't be surprised if you find out that the CDC is controlling a lot more than what you think they're controlling in regards to public health and safety and your ability to go to work and make a living for your family. So I hope that this helps somebody out there. I know that it definitely helped me. I used all this information when the fight came to my door, and I encourage everybody else to stand up and say something and fight against these intrusions onto your privacy, onto your body, onto your personal choices. Because if they take an inch today, it will turn into a mile tomorrow. That's all I have for you guys, and I will catch you on the next one.